In this video, we're going to look at the data access modes in XAF. Our tagline for this video is IObjectSpace, one API to rule them all. And hopefully by the end of the video, you'll see why. So here's the agenda. We're going to talk about the IObjectSpace API and how it's the bridge between our XAF application and our database. It doesn't matter which ORM you choose. It can be Entity Framework Core, or XPO. It can even be a SQL database you're using behind the ORM. We'll look at the data access modes that come out of the box with XAF. You'll see how client, server, data view, and instant feedback can improve application performance, and how understanding these data access modes will really help us get an idea of how XAF is loading our data under the hood, and how we can intersect that behavior if we need to make any changes. We'll look at lazy loading and navigation properties. We're going to talk about non-persistent objects, or POCO classes, and how they're really helpful when we don't need an object that is mapped to any persistent class or to a table on the database, and how we can use them as auxiliary parameters or for connecting to external data, and so on. We'll also be reviewing some helpful classes like XPView, XPQuery, and XafDataView that allows more efficient loading of the data. Sometimes we need to bring the whole object. Other times we only need to bring a couple of properties, or we only need a subset of the data. And there is no need to load the whole complete reference because that actually degrades the performance, especially when we're using remote databases or have more complex scenarios. We're going to look at some situations where we have to get data from several tables, and we have to do a lot of processing. And bringing that amount of data from different places will actually, again, slow down the application. In this case, we can move that processing to our database server, and that way, we only have to bring the data we need to our application. That means that we can create a database view and map it to one of our persistent objects. And right away, we have a really fast, efficient loading of the data without slowing down our application. An important thing to keep in mind is that XAF apps are regular .NET apps, and one of the key factors here is database maintenance. As time passes, we'll need to do some maintenance to prevent poor performance, system downtime, and data loss. Neither XAF nor XPO provides any means for tuning, performance analysis, backups, and synchronization, so you do have to do that as time passes. You may have to create indexes and review your SQL execution plan. We're also going to cover how to access XAF data in a non-XAF app. Sometimes we need to use the data from our application in a mobile environment, in a web service, or some other scenario. We're going to review all that here as well. So, let's get started. Okay, let's talk about how XAF accesses and handles data. First and foremost, you need to think about business and domain objects, and that's why the ORM concept is really important here. Because you shouldn't be thinking about a stored procedure, SQL statements, tables, and databases. You should be thinking in a domain, in an object-oriented manner. And again, that's why the ORM part is really important. And this is where the IObjectSpace API comes into place. It gives us a means to work without having to know which ORM or which database we're going to use. If we're using XPO or Entity Framework, we will have access to all relational databases that these two ORMs can handle. And we've seen other cases where an XAFer has even implemented their own object space provider that allows mapping to a different ORM, like Hibernate, for example. That is one of the community samples that we have. So the IObjectSpace API, as we saw in the last XAF overview video, is a common way to access data in XAF without having to worry about which ORM or database type we're using. It doesn't matter if it's XPO Entity Framework, MySQL, or SQL Server. IObjectSpace gives us the means to access data in a common way. And of course, it's not a random object in the space. And we have a couple object spaces. The XP object space, when we're using XPO as our data model, uses the session under the hood to access the data. The EF object space is going to be using the DB context for the same goal. Same with EF core object space. We also have the non-persistent object space that's used to manage non-persistent objects not mapped to any objects in the database. And all of these object spaces have the common interface, that is the IObjectSpace API that is actually giving us all that functionality. We have a couple more object spaces like the secured object space, the XP nested object space, and the secured EF object space. There's also an async version of all of these object spaces, but we're not going to go too in depth in this video. I just wanted to mention it. Okay, let's go to Visual Studio. I'll be jumping back and forth in between here in the slides so you can understand the concept and then see it in action. So here we have a new blank application. We haven't done anything with it. The first thing that I want to show is if we go to the updater right here, we have a couple of methods. We have the update database after update schema. That is the moment in our application lifecycle where we can provide initial data. What we see here is commented, but we can create a new domain object and provide initial values to its properties and so on. And we also have the update database before update schema that allows you to do some database maintenance like renaming a column, dropping a column, or things like that. We can check the version and these types of database operations. Now what I want to show here is that we have access to the object space in this method. If we go to definition, you can check that is of type IObjectSpace. And if we go inside, we can check the implementation of the IObjectSpace API. Here we have a lot of properties for transaction handling. Is committing, is deleting, is modified. You can also see that we have a lot of events like object changed, object saving, object saved, and refreshing. We can also have all our CRUD operations, create collection, create data view. All these methods, all these properties are completely ORM-agnostic. We can check here, find object, first or default. That is the one that allows you to pass a link expression. We have get objects and others. So you can see we have a lot of properties, methods, and so on. There is no reference at all to which ORM we're using or which database we're using. So it doesn't matter if it's XPO, Entity Framework, or any SQL database. If we control this IObjectSpace API, we can control all data access and XAF. Now let's continue and start reviewing all the data access modes. I have another project here that has just one class, customer, with the normal name, address, active birthday, and salary properties. And in the updater, I'm using a bogus NuGet package to create fake data generating 1 million records. Actually, I already have 93,000 records in there. So we'll add 1 million more. Let's run it and review all the data access modes that XAF provides out of the box. You can see that we have 1,093,000 records on this table. Of course, we don't have any reference property. We don't have any relationship, but that's a lot of records. Let's go to the model and review all the data access modes we have there. So we can check here that it's on server mode, but we also have client, data view, instant feedback, IF view, and server view. Let's review one by one. I'll start with client and save in client mode. It will take a little bit more time because you have to load those 1 million other records. So it's definitely going to retrieve all that data from the database and have it available here in our application. You know what? Let me make this window a bit smaller so we can see the output where the queries get generated. And that's because I have the setting on the app config where we say that. Please show me the queries that XPO is generating. With that one over there, we're going to actually see that when it gets here to load in client mode, it did the query and loaded all those 1 million+ records. Now, one important part about the client side is that it's appropriate for most of the cases when you don't have a lot of data. But in this case, we're testing with more than 1 million records. You see that if I try to sort here, there is a long delay. And this is just a class with just a couple of properties. Imagine if you have more property relationships, it will definitely slow down your application to where the performance will become unacceptable. So let's compare now with server mode. In server mode, you won't load the whole data set. It will only load a portion of the data set. and as we scroll or page, it will request more data on demand. So if you check the console here, actually let's clear this, and we're going to see that as soon as we start scrolling, it's asking for more information. If we keep scrolling more and more, it loads data on demand, but not only that. If you see, as soon as I scroll, it stops for a second. So it's loading data and locking the UI while doing those operations. Let's select another one. Let's do instant feedback, and then we'll come back to DataView. So instant feedback, it works pretty similar to the server, but you'll see the UI doesn't get locked up. It's actually loading data on a background thread, and you can keep scrolling. It keeps doing more requests, but the UI stays completely responsive. You can cancel or do any other edit. But in server mode, it definitely locks the UI. So let's review now. Data view, server view, and instant feedback view. While we're doing data view, what is happening is that XAF will bring a read-only light version of your object and not the whole object. We can actually see it. So I have a current object action here, and we can see it's just a simple controller with a simple action. And in the execute, we're going to check what the current object is bringing us. So we click on that action, and we're stopped here. We can see that this current object is bringing our XPO data view. If we think about this, the data view mode brings us the XAF data view that will have, depending on the ORM, XPO data view or EF data view under the hood. It doesn't have the exact current object. If we need to bring the current object, we'll have to do ObjectSpace.getObject and pass the object. Let's put another breakpoint here. Now, we do have a customer, so that's the only difference, but it's really efficient, and the whole amount of queries that it was doing before was reduced to 1. Okay, let's continue on to server view mode and instant feedback view mode. They work in the same way. Server view mode loads data on demand, but it also doesn't return the object. It returns an object record, and instant feedback view does the same, but in an asynchronous way. So let's do server view, and let's again click the controller. We'll wait for it to load. Now, if I click here again, I have an object record, and again, I'll have to do ObjectSpace.getObject to be able to access my object customer. And the last one, instant feedback view, will do the same. The difference is it will do it in an asynchronous way. You see, you can scroll, do anything, I select, and it brings an object record. Let's review what we've covered so far. We have data access modes, client, server, server view, data view, instant feedback, and instant feedback view. The client loads the entire data set at once. So the application performance depends also on the client hardware on the computer that is actually doing all the processing and is loading every record on that table. So it's not suitable for 10,000 records or other large data sets. As I just showed, the sorting group and filtering can lock the app and become a bottleneck. As we saw, there was a small delay every time that I was trying to sort them by name. The next two access modes are server and server view. These both do data portions on demand. They don't load the entire data set, but they lock the UI and don't respond to end user action when data is retrieved. So in the time the data is loaded from the database, the UI is completely locked. And of course, all operations happen on the server, like grouping, sorting, and filtering. That really improves the performance because we're moving that processing to the server. And the server view is the fastest of the synchronous data access modes. It's the fastest because it returns a light version of that object record. And every access mode is available to XPO. But, for example, server view is not available to EF, just server. Let's continue. We have instant feedback and instant feedback view. Here, all the functionality is similar to server. The difference is that it's loading all the data in a background thread. So the UI remains responsive and the processor is not locking the UI. Instant feedback is also available for Entity Framework, but instant feedback view is not. And instant feedback view is the faster of the asynchronous data access modes. So now we have data view that is like flattening the object because it will retrieve an XAF data view that we saw in our case using XPO. It will be an XPO data view lightweight read-only list of data records all at once. So it will take your object with reference collections and everything, it will flatten it out. For example, it would replace all reference properties with their default nested properties. If we use the XAF default property for, let's say we have a customer and that customer has a department, that will bring the default property of the department and not the whole department. And as a summary, if you have a large number of records, use server or instant feedback. If you have a complicated structure, like many reference properties, you use data view. So we can flatten that object. And if you have a large number of records with a complicated structure, use server view or instant feedback. Do not use client. Client is a great mode, it's just not suitable, especially for large data sets. Now that we've seen the data access mode that XAF provides out of the box, there are some scenarios, like especially when you have remote databases, for example on Azure, or a server that is far away from your clients. You need to think a little bit more about the design because every trip to the database will slow down the application and will degrade the performance. So, with that in mind, let's go over lazy loading non-persistent objects and some useful classes like XPView, XPQuery, and XafDataView. Let's start with lazy loading. We have another project where we have a product class and another class. If we check, the order has an association with product and the product has a collection of order. So let's run it to see what we have. And the first point that we want to show is lazy loading. It's a design pattern used to defer initialization of an object until we really need it. So again, we're not going to load that object until we really need it. Let's see it in action. Let's log in. And again, we have our product and our order class. And let's close this for a second and clear the console. So now let's open the order list view and see the queries that were generated. We have a lot of them, but most of them are belonging to the security system. And we can cover that in another video. Navigation state roles, stored password, those sort of things. The ones that we want to look at are these two last ones. One is going to the order table, and the second one is going to the product table. So the order, of course, we're opening the order list view. And the product is going to that one as well in a separate query to bring the product that's associated to that order. Let's clear the console and do another test. We have these lazy loading simple actions. I'll click on it and review the code. We're creating a collection of products. You can see that not even one query has been generated. Click continue. And then we can see that as soon as we touch it, the first query was generated when we go to the product. But if we take a look at this product and check the orders, you see the orders collection hasn't been loaded yet. It's not until we actually call for it that the second query about the orders that product has will be generated. And this is the lazy loading concept in action. Let's click continue and put the breakpoint here. We already saw that it did a query to the order table. So it's loading the data on demand. And it's important to remember if you have to create all those queries by hand, you wouldn't abuse that simplicity for the developer. I'm sure that we've all done this at some point, where we do something like invoice.invoicedetails.customer.country.continent or something like that. My point is every time that you're doing that, we are generating more and more queries, and that can get really big and can definitely have a big impact on performance. That's why the design of how you plan to use only the data you need is really important. Let's go back and clear the console and close the list view and open it again. If you remember, we review these two queries that got generated, one from the order and one for the product. But what happens if we want to have less trips to the database? In this case, we can do something like go to the order, and in the product, we can put the attribute explicit loading. This makes sure that when we are retrieving the order, we bring the product as well. So let's see it. Let's run that again. You can see now, after all the security system queries, we only have one. And if we look closer, we're going to see that it's going to the order table and doing a left joint with the product. So with that one query, we do just one trip to the database, and we bring all the information that we need. Now, how about when I'm doing some processing in a controller and need to access the object, but I don't need to have the complete object loaded, or I only need to know a few properties? All right, let's see how this works. We have a couple actions here, and let's go one by one. Let's do create collection. We see here we are creating a collection of products, and let's clear the console. Remember, at this point, there's not a single query being generated. So let's click continue and let's see the query. It's going and bringing the OID, the name, description, optimistic locking, and GC record. It's bringing every property of that product collection, and that's fine in some cases. But there's times when we only need to know just name and description and not the other three properties of that object. Okay, let's review XafDataView. And in this case, this data view is what we are using on the data view access mode. But you can see here we're creating data view and we're saying, I only want to get the name I want to have as well as the order count. And that will give me a list of the XPO data view records. You can see here that we can check on the console, we can check that the query is only bringing us the name, and it's doing another select for the count on the order table. This will help performance because we're not bringing every property of the class as we're doing with the collection. Now let's check and create an XPView. Here we're getting the session, and in this session we're creating a new XPView. And right here we can then create new view properties. And here, let's see, we can say I only want the name on the product, and I want the sort direction. We're going to see what the product name is in the console. I'll click continue, and let's see chai and coffee. And when selected, the query is only bringing from the product the name. That's it, nothing else. Pretty cool, huh? Now we also have another great class that is the XPQuery in this one. And one of the great things about this is that we can actually do link expressions. So let's see right here, we're doing an XPQuery of product again. We're passing the session, and if you see right here, we are saying in that query, please bring me everything that has the name chai. Let's select that one and iterate it on the list. You can see there's no query being done yet. If we click new, we see that the query says select name, description, and so on. So all the fields where name equals chai. Here we can do a link expression that we're used to, but one caveat here, you see it's bringing every property. Why is that? Because we're selecting the whole object. So if we do something like, let's come back to this, and we're going to do new, and we want to say .name, let's see. We have to stop and running again. Let's clear the console and let's do it again. Click Create XPO Query. So again, same as before, the only difference is now we're only asking for the name. You see that the query is only saying select name from product. That's it, where name equals chai. This is great because not only can we use a link expression, we can also say, don't bring me the whole object, just bring the property I want. XPQuery is one of my favorites. Okay, moving on. XAF also has another method that if we can see here, the object space called the getObjectsQuery, and we can do a link expression here as well, where we can say where the name is different, like coffee, or we can even say .select, and it will behave the same way. And again, let's clear the console for a second. You can see the query is now bringing everything, OID, name, description. And because we're iterating the whole object, the whole product, but if we do a select, it will act the same as the XP query. So it will only bring the properties that we need. Let's continue. Now, another interesting case, if we remember, we talked about the explicit loading attribute that allows us to bring the reference property in just one query. But in this case, we're hard coding an attribute and that behavior, but it will happen all the time. And what if we want to do it conditionally? So only sometimes, but other times we don't need to do it, or we want to do it in a controller. And so for that reason, we have the session prefetch method. It will allow us to load all related data in just one operation. And let's see it. First, let's do it without prefetch. You can see here that the query belongs to the security system. Let me clear the console. And so far what we're doing is we're accessing the session while creating a new XP collection of product. And if we click continue, it will go and do the query for the product table. Click continue again, and it will do it for the order table. And that's the lazy loading. It's not going to do the query from the orders if we actually don't touch it. This is the normal behavior without the prefetch. We're running, bringing the product, and then bringing in the order in two separate queries. What if we want to do it in just one? Let's continue and see how it works with prefetch. I'll clear the console and let's run it. We are, again, accessing the session, creating an XP collection of product, creating one for the order. And then we're going to take the member info of the order collection in the product class, and we're going to call the prefetch, and we're going to pass the product collection, the order collection, and the member info. Let's see what it brings. You can see here, it does the query, and it does a joint in between the order table and the product table. So it will be loading all related data in just one operation. With just one query, you get all the information you need. We don't need to make more trips to the database. It's really handy, and it can be a lifesaver when we want to improve the application performance. Now let's review the non-persistent objects. We have right here two navigations with non-persistent objects and a POCO class. Let's see the difference in code. We have our non-persistent objects and our class. It's just a POCO class, name and description. There is no inheritance. There's just the attribute, domain component, and that will tell XAF, please add this class into the type info subsystem so it can be used on the application model. It can create views for it, and so on. And we also have the non-persistent objects inherited from one of the base classes that XAF provides. That is the non-persistent based object, and that's where the non-persistent object space gets in place. If we think about this, the non-persistent object isn't mapped to any table. In fact, it's not mapped to a database at all, so why would we use it? There are some cases where we need to get data from an external source, a text file, JSON, or a web service. And this can be really handy for that. We can use it as an auxiliary parameter, as we'll see here soon. So let's go to the module, and you can see here that we're actually in this setup complete event. We're connecting to the object space, a creation event. And from there, we're going to check if there is a non-persistent object space, and we're going to use the non-persistent object space objects getting event. And we're going to provide just one object of each one POCO class and one non-persistent object. And with only that configuration, we can see right now that we have our non-persistent and POCO class. Let's analyze this a little more. In this case, we can see that in this object space, objects getting event, that we can actually create a list of objects. We can call a web service. We can create JSON files, and we will have that data available for us when we need it. No need to create a table, no need to connect to a database. We are just going to use it and continue our normal operation. Now let's see something else that we can do with non-persistent objects. Let's say that we want to have an action. And before the action gets executed, we want to ask for some information. Like if we have a task and we want to postpone it. I'll say, what day do you want to postpone it to? Or maybe we need the name of a customer. We can check that customer or any data we need. We can do something like this. We can create a method. We can call it myAction. And we can pass that non-persistent object, that POCO class, as a parameter. And if we add the action attribute, let's call it again myAction. And run it so you can see. I'll put a breakpoint here. Okay, let's log in and go to the order. You can see here we have a My Action button, and when we click on it, it gives us the detail view of the POCO class. And we can say here any name, and that could be any field. And when we click OK, we're going to have that parameter here so we can do something. We can do any processing with that information that's coming from our POCO class. Non-persisting objects are really cool when we're using data that's not in our database. It's also a great way to have additional information in our actions if we need it. If you see here, this is a simple action. We don't have to create a pop-up action and customize the pop-up window and so on. Here's another example of this. We have a non-persistent class with a property called message. Every time that we want to give a message to the user in an agnostic way, we can create that non-persistent detail view and set the message property. And we're good to go. That's an agnostic way to have a pop-up message in every platform, Windows, web, and Blazor. Let's review. We've seen the IObjectSpace API, data access modes, lazy loading, non-persistent objects, XPView, XPQuery, and XafDataView. Let's continue with database views and go over mapping persistent objects, then database maintenance, and finally using XafData in a non-XAF app. There are certain cases that we need to have a report, or we need to access data from several tables. We have a complex calculation that we need data from 7 tables, and there are a lot of queries being generated. And so the application starts degrading and performance becomes slow. What do we do? An easy way to go about this is creating a database view. We give the accessing 7 tables part to the database instead of the application. Then we map a persistent object to that database view and we can access it everywhere. Let's see this in action. I'll go back to our application. Actually, let's go to the database. Here we have our product table. We can create a view and pretty much let's do a simple select OID name from product. That's it. Let's run it. Perfect. Of course, this is as simple as it can get, but right here you can do really complex joins from several tables. You can do anything you need. Let's save it. Now let's call it Demo View. So now that we already have a view here, we can go to our application and let's create a new class. I'll call it Demo View. Now let's just replace this code with this one and add the namespaces. Okay, let's see what we have here. We have a class called DemoView that has the same name as a view, so we don't need this persistent attribute. But if we had a different name, this persistent attribute allows us to map to a different view name. And we're going to have the default class options. So we get, as always, the navigation, the report, the creatable item, and so on. We're using the XPLite object because it's the one that allows us to map legacy tables. We don't have to provide OID. We don't need the defer deletion because we're not going to be deleting or modifying any object in a view. We don't need Optimus locking. Right here we see we have the OID and it will be the key. Every view that is mapped to a persistent object needs to have a unique key so we can map it to the grid, etc. To have a better user experience, we're going to set the model default allow edit to false, so you can't modify a key property. Even if you could modify this key property in the application UI, you wouldn't be able to save it because it is a read-only database view. We're going to have the names or the properties that we have on the view, and in their on saving and on deleting, we're going to throw an exception saying this can't be deleted because of views. We cannot modify with that in place. Actually, this key property should be of the system.GUID type and not string. And let's change it for a field as well. With just that one, we'll see that we have this object available in a list view and detail view available on the dashboards. And in this case, it's just a simple view. But even if it's really complex, it will actually improve the performance because all that processing is getting data from different places and it'll be moved to the database part, not to the application. You can see we have the navigation, we have our list view here with our product, the OID and the name. A real performance booster. And I recommend it in cases where you have to do this type of operation. Okay, there's one more thing that I want to show here. Now that we're talking about the database part of the application, let's stop at the updater real quick. Let's say that in an XPO-based application like this one, we get the session of the XPO object space. I want to show that right here. We have all these methods: execute query, execute non-query, and execute a stored procedure. So with all these methods, we can execute any query, any stored procedure that we need, and it will go and execute that processing on the database side. This is really nice when we already have business logic on stored procedures and we just need a custom query and so on. But the only drawback here is that it's specific to the database that you're using. If you're using MySQL or PostgreSQL, that query might not translate to another database. So it won't be as simple as just changing the connection string, but these are definitely useful methods that are available to you in case you need it. Let's comment that out again. And now let's move to the slides for a second. Database maintenance. We all know that the database requires ongoing maintenance to prevent poor application performance, system downtime, and data loss. This is not something that XAF and XPO takes care of. XAF and XPO, even if they created the database, create the table with default settings and the application can be used for some time without maintenance. It's important that you know that for optimal performance and reliability, this database must still be maintained. You will either need a database administrator or you need to be aware of this important part. That means a SQL execution plan. That means creating and dropping an index. That means fine-tuning your database so your application remains performant. And in the case where you haven't released your app yet, I recommend testing everything as close to the production environment as possible. I know that sometimes we don't have the luxury to have a database administrator. I just want to give you advice for those cases when we can't afford to have someone only focused on the database. So one thing that we do is we take our database and we put in on Azure on a free account and we let it run for a while. And after a while, Azure Advisor will give us recommendations of what we can do to improve our database performance. And that can be things like we're seeing in the picture, creating index, dropping index, basic schema issues, and so on. Not only that, if it goes a little further, it even gives you security recommendations like firewall rules that should be tracked, auditing should be enabled, DBO user should not be used for normal service operation, and so on. Please keep in mind that even if XAF and XPO helped with all the database creation and tasks, such as creating new columns, you still must be mindful of your database performance through maintenance on the back end. Now, before moving to accessing XAF data in non-XAF apps, let's quickly talk about another tool that DevExpress provides. The XPO Profiler allows you to see all these queries, and it's not in the Visual Studio console, and we can even use it for applications that are already in production. Let's go to our project and go to the program class. We have to add this line as early as possible and before the application starts. Optionally, we can introduce a flag in the application configuration file to enable or disable this functionality without rebuilding our app. For demo purposes, we will have this flag always on. The XPO Profiler will communicate with our app using named pipes. There are other connection methods, but this one is the simplest if you're using Windows applications. Next, we go to the Visual Studio menu, Extensions, DevExpress, All Platforms, Run XPO Profiler. Now let's close everything we have here, and we're going to go New. And right here, we're going to choose Name Pipes and put the same exact string that we have on our application. In this case, it was this one. So we have it here. Now let's run that application. And now, of course, let's click Start. If we see here, as our application is running, the XPO profile is generating all the queries, as well as other information that the console provides like session events, commands, and so on. Now, we're not going too deep into the XPO Profiler, but I just want to mention that you have these tools available to profile your already deployed application, or to go more in depth and check these queries that are getting executed. What are the parameters being sent, and so on. Okay, let's move on to the last topic. We're going to cover how to access XAF data in a non-XAF app. For that, I have another application. And I brought over the order class and the product class. In a different scenario where we would have a big number of classes, we do these in a separate class library and we'll share that one between both projects. But this is enough for this demo. We're going to bring over the Packages Express app, Express App XPO, and Persistent Base. With this, it's a simple call. We pretty much are getting the type info registering our order class, creating a new XPO ObjectSpace provider, passing our connection string. And with that one, we can already create an object space and iterate the order. Let's add a console.read line at the end so we can see the console. And let's run it. You can see here we have order 3, 2, 1, 9, everything. So let's check our XAF application and let's go to the order. And that's exactly what we have on our XAF application. Just like that, we have access to our XAF data in a non-XAF app. It's also good to mention that this capability is not specific to the XPO ORM, and you can also do it in Entity Framework 6 and Entity Framework Core. The only difference is that for the Entity Framework ORM, we'll be creating an EF Object Space Provider or EF Core Object Space Provider instead of an XP Object Space Provider. The rest will remain the same because of the ORM-agnostic IObjectSpace interface for data access. Now, these types of applications are good when we need to do some data maintenance, so CRUD operations. But in cases where we have to access XAF data from a mobile application, for example, we can't use this because we're connecting directly to our database, and we should be using a middle tier, a web service, to connect from the mobile app to the web service and from the web service to the database. In this case, we have several options. You have WCF, but we're not going to cover this because it's not moving to .NET 5. You have OData, and we've seen XAFers use GraphQL. You have Web API, and in all those cases, you need to be mindful of serialization, of sharing our business model, and so on. But now, in 20.2, DevExpress has a new option available, and that's what I want to show you for the rest of the video. Let's take a quick look at the documentation about transferring data through REST API, and then we'll come back to our project. You'll see here there are two main classes, the Web API Data Store Service and the Web API Data Store Client. One is allowing us to implement the XPO controllers that we'll need in our Web API project. And the second one will help to connect to that backend service from any client that we're using. It can be a console, it can be another web app, it can be Xamarin. Now let's check the project XAF Web API backend that's implementing our controller so that we can use XPO and access the data through a web service. In our startup class, the configurations that we need to implement are: first, we'll have to add the connection string in our app settings and bring that connection string here. From there, we're going to create a data store through the get connection provider. And we're going to pass the connection string, and the auto create options and schema already exist because we already did that. We already created our tables and our database in the XAF version of this app. And then we're going to add it to the services, and we're going to pass the Web API Data Store service that we were talking about. That takes a data store in the constructor. And we need to also include the XML serializers formatters so it knows how to properly serialize our business objects. With that configuration in place, now we can go and create our XPO controller. You'll see we have the Web API Data Store service that is being injected through dependency injection in our constructor. And then we have update schema, select data, and modify methods to take care of all the CRUD operations that we need. It's good also to mention that we can also use the data cache route to support cache in our web service. And if we do that, we'll essentially include these other post operations about modified data with cookies, select data with cookies, or data schema with cookies, and so on. That will let our Web API service know when to modify data, when to use the cache, when to reset the cache, and so on. This is all we need to do on the setup for our backend service. Now let's review the client part. I'll go back to our console application where we accessed XAF data before, and let's just comment this part out. Let's make some room and let's add a few lines of code. So with only these lines of code, if we check, we are using the Web API Data Store Client to get the connection string. And the connection string will be our service XPO because it's the name of the XPO controller. And it's important to note that you should add this backslash here because as it shows in the documentation, the HTTP client excludes the last segment of the base address. Let's go back to our application. Here we're creating our default data layer and we're using the getDataLayer method passing the connection string. And again, AutoCreateOption.schema already exists. And pretty much you just create a collection that when we don't pass a parameter on the constructor, it will take the default data layer. And we iterate to the order. And as we did before in the last example, we just print the description of the order. First, I'll run the API controller just to verify that it's working. And you can see it's going to the localhost /XAF web API backend /weather forecast, because that's the other controller we have. It's the one that comes by default in the template of the web API project, and it's bringing all the data. So that's working. And we can even use our IP address. And that's working. Now you can see, even if we stop, and let's copy the URL, if we stop the project, we can go and it will be working. And I actually set up an SSL server, and if we add the name of the computer, it comes back secure. And that's exactly why we are using it in our project, if we check the program. And that's important, especially if you're using it in a mobile application like iOS and Android. They will definitely require HTTPS. Okay, so with that in place, and I just show that because we're using IIS and not IIS Express, the service remains running. Now, if we run the startup project, voila, we are accessing XAF data outside of XAF through a REST service. How cool is that? We can use it in mobile, we can use it in web, we can use it in WinForms, everywhere where we don't want to connect directly to the database, where we want to have that middle tier of security in place. Okay, let's summarize what we've just seen. We've covered the IObjectSpace API, one API to rule them all. And my advice here is to learn the IObjectSpace API. With only that, you don't need to know about what ORM you're using or the database. You'll have all your CRUD operations and everything you need to manage data inside of XAF. Learn your data access modes and know when to use them. If you have a large amount of records or your business objects have a complicated structure, if you need it synchronous or asynchronous, it'll help so much. When there's just a simple change, going from server to server view or going from client to instant feedback to data view will make a big difference in your application. Load only the data you need, and that's important, especially when you're designing your model. Most of the time, users want to have everything available. I want to have everything in my column chooser. I want to have all the information that you can provide me. But the truth is, do you really need to have that much data loaded at a certain point? I don't think so. A good approach is to give the must-have data and then create an action, a pop-up, or some other type of mechanism where they can get more data on demand if they need it. And if they don't, if there is something that they check once a week or once a month, we should not be loading that data because that will degrade the performance of the application. Of course, profile. Test your application as close as possible as your production environment with the number of users and records. That will give you the most accurate performance measure. And we have, through Visual Studio, the settings to see all the queries generated, but we also have the XPO Profiler when we have our application deployed. Of course, as I mentioned before, if you have to get data from a lot of tables, maybe it doesn't make sense to do all that processing on our application. Instead, we can move that processing into the database part. Do a database view mapped to a persistent object, and the performance will improve by leaps and bounds. Also, really important, never, never, never forget database maintenance. As time passes, you'll always have to give your database some love. If you have a database administrator, perfect. If not, you can do it yourself. But don't take for granted that even if XAF created your database with recommended settings, as time passes, you must go to your database. Check the SQL execution plan, say check what queries are taking the longest, create some indexes, and so on. And we have seen how to access XAF data outside of XAF. So we can use it in Xamarin, we can use it in Windows, we can use it in the web and any other application where we don't want to expose our connection string. And it's a really elegant approach because we can keep using XPO as we use it inside XAF with the commit changes and with XP collection and so on. If you follow all of these recommendations, you should have a great application with great performance. We have seen XAFers going from an operation that lasted 6 hours down to 6 minutes, going from a ListView that took like 5 to 10 minutes to open down to a few seconds. And you can imagine the joy on those XAFers' faces after improving the performance that greatly. XAF is a great framework for line of business applications. It takes care of a lot of low-level tasks. Again, UI generation, database tasks as database creation, table creation, adding a new column, and so on. So if they're already doing all of that for us, and we're able to fine-tune the performance, to fine-tune the data access, to know how everything is working under the hood, and customize it to our specific needs. I hope you were able to get a better understanding of accessing data with XAF. If you like this video, give us a thumbs up. If you have questions, please comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you get notified every time we release new XAF content. Thanks for watching, and thank you for choosing DevExpress.